The glass shattered against the wall before I even understood what Daniel had said. I stood frozen at the head of the table, the engagement dinner my mother had planned for 3 months turning into the worst moment of my life in front of 40 guests. Daniel Whitmore, the man I had loved since college, the man whose ring sat on my finger, was pointing at me like I was something he had found stuck to his shoe. "You embarrass me, Claire," he said, his voice carrying across the private dining room of the restaurant my family could barely afford. "You have always embarrassed me. I should have ended this a year ago." My hands trembled. I looked at my mother, whose face had gone pale, and at my younger sister Grace, who had half risen from her chair like she meant to throw herself between us. The other guests, Daniel's business partners, his parents, my aunts and uncles, all sat in silence, some looking away, some staring with open curiosity, as if my humiliation were a show they had paid to see. I did not understand yet that he had already chosen someone else. I found out in the next breath. "This is Vivian," he announced, gesturing toward the entrance where a woman in a deep red dress walked in like she owned the room. Her family owns half the shipping routes on the eastern coast. She understands what it means to build something you never did. Vivian smiled at me, not cruelly, but with the practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment. She placed her hand on Daniel's arm, as if claiming a piece of furniture. I want to say I found the strength to speak, to defend myself, to throw something back at him with the same force he had thrown at me. But I did not. I sat there with the diamond on my finger, feeling heavier than it had ever felt, and I said nothing, because there was nothing I could say that would undo the 3 years I had given him. My father, who had passed away 2 winters before, was not there to see it, and for the first time that night, I was grateful for something. He would have stood up. He would have said the words I could not find. Grace found her voice instead. She stood fully now, her chair scraping loud against the floor. "You do not get to do this to her in front of everyone," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "You do not get to humiliate her because you found someone with more money." Daniel laughed, the sound cold and short. "Sit down, Grace. This does not concern you." "It concerns all of us," my mother said quietly, finally finding her own voice, though it trembled with something between anger and grief. "You invited us here to celebrate. You have turned it into a spectacle." I felt every eye in the room on me. I felt the weight of the ring, the weight of the years, the weight of a future I had built entirely around a man who was now smiling at another woman, while I sat there like a stranger at my own funeral. I stood up. My legs did not feel like mine, but I stood, and I pulled the ring from my finger with hands that would not stop shaking. I placed it on the white tablecloth in front of Daniel, and for 1 second, just one, I looked directly into his eyes. "I hope she makes you happy," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "I hope she never finds out what it feels like to sit where I am sitting." Then I walked out. The restaurant hallway felt endless, the exit door impossibly far, but I kept my head up because I refused to let anyone see me break before I reached the street. Grace called after me, but I told her to stay with our mother. I needed the cold air more than I needed comfort in that moment. Outside, the rain had started without warning, the kind of sudden downpour that soaks through fabric in seconds. I stood on the curb in my pale blue dress, the one I had chosen because Daniel once said blue suited me, and I let the rain hit my face because it gave me an excuse for the tears that had finally started to fall. Cars passed. No taxis stopped. My phone was still inside, forgotten on the table beside the ring I no longer wore. I had nothing but the clothes I stood in, and the humiliation still ringing in my ears. That was when the black car pulled up. It was long, sleek, the kind of vehicle that belonged to people who never worried about money. The rear door opened, though at first I thought it was for someone else, someone waiting behind me. I turned to look, but the sidewalk was empty, except for me and the rain. A man stepped out from the front passenger seat, an umbrella already open above his head, and walked toward me with an ease that suggested storms never truly touched him. He was tall, dressed in a dark coat that seemed untouched by the rain despite the wind, and his eyes, when they finally settled on mine, held none of the pity or curiosity I had seen from the guests inside. "You are soaked," he said simply, holding the umbrella slightly over me without asking permission, without making it strange. "I do not need help," I said, though my voice cracked on the last word. "I did not say you needed help," he replied. "I said you are soaked. There is a difference." Something about his calmness cut through the noise still spinning in my head. I studied him properly then, the sharp line of his jaw, the quiet authority in the way he stood, like a man who had never once in his life needed to raise his voice to be heard. "My name is Adrian Cole," he said. "I was at a meeting 2 streets from here. I saw you walk out of that restaurant like the building was on fire." "It might as well have been," I said before I could stop myself. He did not ask what happened. He did not press for details the way strangers usually do when they sense a story. He simply reached into his coat and produced a card, plain black with silver lettering, and held it out to me. "If you ever need a place that is not filled with the kind of people who make you disappear at your own dinner, call this number," he said. "No conditions. No expectations." I took the card because the rain was making it hard to think of a reason not to. I did not know then who Adrian Cole truly was, what his name meant in rooms far more dangerous than the one I had just left. I only knew that his eyes held something steady, something unshaken, at the exact moment I needed steadiness, more than anything else in the world. He returned to his car without another word, the door closing softly, the vehicle pulling away into the rain-soaked street, until its lights disappeared around the corner. I stood there a long moment, the card damp between my fingers, my dress clinging to me, my heart still raw from what had happened inside. Grace found me a few minutes later, holding an umbrella of her own, her eyes red from crying on my behalf. "Who was that?" she asked, nodding toward where the car had gone. "I do not know," I said honestly, slipping the card into the small pocket of my dress, "but I think I am about to find out." We walked home together in silence, the city lights blurring through the rain, and I did not look back at the restaurant even once. Somewhere behind me, Daniel was likely still smiling beside Vivian, already forgetting the woman he had discarded in front of everyone who mattered to her. Grace kept glancing at me as we walked, the way she used to when we were children, and she worried I would fall behind on our way home from school. She had always been the braver one, quicker to speak, quicker to fight, while I had spent years learning to keep the peace, to smooth things over, to make myself smaller so that other people could feel bigger beside me. I understood that night, walking through the rain with my sister, that being small had never once protected me from being hurt. "You are not going back to him, are you?" Grace asked, though it was less a question than a demand for reassurance. "There is nothing to go back to," I said. "He made that very clear." She reached for my hand, and for a while neither of us spoke, the rain filling the silence between us with its steady rhythm. When we reached our building, our mother was already waiting by the window, her face still carrying the shock of the evening, though she had composed herself enough to have tea waiting on the small kitchen table. She did not ask what I planned to do. She simply held me the way she had when I was a child who had scraped a knee, as if the years between then and now had folded away, and I was small again, needing nothing more than her arms around me. I let myself cry there, finally, in the warmth of our kitchen, away from the eyes of strangers who had watched me lose everything without lifting a hand to help. Later, alone in my room, I changed out of the ruined dress and sat by the window with a blanket around my shoulders. The city outside had not paused for my heartbreak. Lights still moved along the avenue. People still laughed somewhere below. Life continued exactly as it always had, indifferent to the wreckage inside me. I thought about the 3 years I had spent with Daniel, the small apartment we had once talked about renovating together, the wedding colors we had argued over more times than I wanted to admit, the future I had shaped entirely around his ambitions while quietly setting aside my own. I had told myself it was compromise. I understood now it had been erasure. My phone, once I retrieved it from Grace, who had gone back for it after I left, held 17 missed messages, most from relatives asking if I was all right, one from Daniel that I did not open, and one from a cousin who simply wrote that Vivian had ordered champagne minutes after I walked out. I read that last message twice, before setting the phone face down on my nightstand, unwilling to let it steal any more of my night. The card remained on my desk, the black surface catching the streetlight in a way that made the silver letters glow faintly. Adrian Cole. I did not know then that the name belonged to a man whose reach extended far beyond a single rain-soaked street. a man whose presence could silence rooms far more dangerous than the one I had left behind. I only knew that something about the way he had looked at me, without pity, without curiosity, had felt like the first honest moment of the entire evening. But I could not stop thinking about the card in my pocket, the calm voice that had offered nothing, and yet somehow felt like more than anything Daniel had given me in 3 years. I did not sleep that night. I sat by my window with the card in my hand, turning it over and over, reading the name printed there, as if it might explain itself if I looked long enough. Adrian Cole. I had never heard the name before, and yet something told me that by the time I did understand who he was, my life would already be irreversibly changed. The rain continued outside, steady and relentless, washing the city clean of a night I would never fully forget. And somewhere in that darkness, a decision was already forming inside me, quiet but certain. I was done being the woman who sat silently while someone else decided her worth. Whatever waited on the other end of that number, I intended to find out. The phone rang 3 days after the dinner, and I almost did not answer, because I did not recognize the number. I had spent those 3 days in a strange fog, going through the motions of my job at the design studio, nodding at coworkers who had heard some version of what happened, avoiding my mother's worried glances every evening when I came home. Daniel had not called. Vivian had posted photographs online, smiling beside him at events I used to attend, and I had made myself stop looking after the 3rd time I caught myself scrolling through them at midnight. I answered the call on the 4th ring, my voice flat, expecting a wrong number, or another relative wanting details I did not want to repeat. "Claire Bennett," a voice said, calm and precise, the same voice from the rain 3 nights before. I sat up straighter, gripping the phone tighter than necessary. "Mr. Cole," I said, surprised at how quickly his name came to my lips. "I wondered if you would call," he said. "Since you did not, I decided to." "I did not know what to say to you," I admitted, because it was the truth. A stranger in the rain, giving me his card, did not exactly come with instructions. There was a pause on the line, brief but deliberate, as though he were choosing his next words the way other men chose their weapons. "I have a proposal for you," he said finally, "not the kind you are used to receiving from men who do not deserve you. A business proposal." I laughed, though there was little humor in it. "I do not have anything you could possibly need, Mr. Cole." "That is where you are wrong," he said. "I need a woman who can stand in a room full of powerful people and not flinch. 3 nights ago, on a sidewalk in the rain, after the worst humiliation of your life, you did not flinch. You stood there, and you did not fall apart in front of me, a stranger. That tells me more about you than any introduction ever could." I did not know how to respond. I walked to my window and looked down at the street, half expecting to see his black car waiting there again, though the road was empty, except for the usual evening traffic. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked. "There is a gala in 2 weeks," he said. "A fundraiser hosted by families who matter in this city, families who also happen to include the Whitmores. I need to attend as an engaged man. It is a matter of business, positioning, reputation, nothing more complicated than that. I am prepared to compensate you generously for playing that role at my side." My stomach tightened at the mention of Daniel's family name. "You knew," I said quietly. "You knew who I was before you gave me that card." "I knew enough," he admitted, his voice steady, without apology. "I make it my business to know things. But I did not stop for you because of who humiliated you. I stopped because of how you carried yourself afterward. I should have been offended. Perhaps some part of me was. But a larger part of me, the part that had spent 3 sleepless nights replaying Daniel's voice across that dinner table, felt something sharpen inside my chest, something that resembled purpose for the first time since the ring left my hand. "Why would I agree to something like this?" I asked, though I already suspected I would. "Because for one night, you would walk into a room on the arm of a man the Whitmores cannot dismiss," he said. "And because I suspect, Claire, that some part of you wants Daniel to watch you become something he no longer has access to." His words landed with uncomfortable precision. I hated that he was right. I hated more that hearing it out loud, from a stranger who owed me nothing, felt like the first time anyone had spoken to the part of me that was still furious, still wounded, still desperate for something that resembled justice. I need to know who you actually are before I agree to anything, I said, my voice firmer now. Meet me tomorrow, he said. I will explain everything you need to know, and nothing more than that. He gave me an address, a private club downtown that I had passed 100 times without ever knowing what waited behind its unmarked entrance. The call ended before I could ask anything further, and I stood by my window for a long while afterward, turning his words over in my mind. Grace found me still standing there when she came to borrow a jacket for work the next morning. You have that look, she said, studying my face carefully. The one you get when you are about to do something reckless. I might have a job offer, I told her, which was not entirely a lie. From who? She asked, narrowing her eyes. Adrian Cole, I said, watching her expression shift from curiosity to something closer to alarm. She set the jacket down slowly. Claire, do you know who that is? I do not, I admitted. Should I? She sat on the edge of my bed, her voice dropping even though we were alone in the apartment. He runs half the city, Claire. Not legally. People do not talk about him in restaurants. They talk about him in whispers, in rooms with the doors closed. My co-worker's brother used to work for one of his rivals. He does not work there anymore. Nobody explains why. A cold feeling moved through me, but strangely, it was not fear. It felt more like clarity, like a door opening onto a room I had not known existed, one that held possibilities far larger and far more dangerous than anything Daniel had ever offered me. I am only meeting him to talk, I said. Nothing has been decided. Grace did not look convinced, but she did not try to stop me either. She had watched me shrink myself for 3 years in Daniel's shadow, and I think some part of her understood that whatever waited for me at that private club, it could not possibly hurt me more than the humiliation I had already survived. The following evening, I dressed carefully, choosing a simple black dress that made me feel like myself again, for the first time since the dinner. The private club sat behind a door with no sign, only a small brass number above the frame. A man in a dark suit checked my name against a list before allowing me inside, and the moment I stepped through, the noise of the street disappeared entirely, replaced by soft lighting and quiet conversation among people who looked like they had never once worried about money in their lives. Adrian was waiting at a corner table, a glass of water in front of him, rather than the alcohol I expected, his attention fully on me the moment I entered. He stood as I approached, an old-fashioned courtesy that Daniel had abandoned somewhere around our 2nd year together. You came, he said, not with surprise but with something closer to quiet satisfaction. I said I would, I replied, taking the seat across from him. He studied me for a long moment before speaking again. Grace told you what I do, he said. It was not a question. I did not deny it. She did. And you came anyway, he said. I came because I wanted to hear it from you, I said. Not from whispers, not from rumors. If I am going to consider your proposal, I want the truth. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of respect that had not been there in his earlier calm assessment of me. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering, though the club was quiet enough that I could hear every word clearly. I inherited a business from my father, he said. It is not the kind of business you read about in glossy magazines. I control certain operations across this city, shipping routes, private security, investments that others prefer to keep unofficial. I have enemies who would very much like to see me weakened, and allies who need to believe I am unshakable. A stable engagement, a woman who can stand beside me without fear, strengthens my position considerably. Why not choose someone from your own world? I asked. Someone who already understands the danger. Because those women come with families who expect things from me, he said. Alliances, favors, debts I have no interest in owing. You are an outsider. You want nothing from my world. That makes you valuable in a way those women could never be. It was not romantic. It was not even particularly flattering, framed as it was in the language of business and strategy. But there was an honesty in it that Daniel had never once offered me. Not even in 3 years of promises that turned out to mean nothing the moment someone wealthier walked into the room. What happens to me if I say yes? I asked. You attend the gala as my fiancé, he said. You wear a ring that means nothing beyond that single night. Daniel and his family will see you standing beside a man they cannot touch, cannot dismiss, cannot humiliate. In exchange, I clear your family's outstanding debts, the ones from your father's medical expenses that I know still weigh on your mother, and I ensure Daniel's family understands there will be consequences if they attempt to embarrass you again." I stared at him, stunned that he knew about my father's debts, details I had never shared with anyone outside my immediate family. Somewhere beneath the fear that thought should have caused, I felt something closer to relief, the exhausting weight of a burden I had carried silently for 2 years, suddenly within reach of being lifted. "How do you know about that?" I asked quietly. "I told you," he said. "I make it my business to know things." I should have walked away then. A reasonable woman, a cautious woman, would have thanked him for his time and returned to her ordinary life, however painful that life had recently become. But I was tired of being reasonable. I was tired of being cautious. 3 years of caution had led me to a dinner table, where I sat in silence, while the man I loved chose someone else in front of everyone who mattered to me. "I will do it," I said. "One night, one gala." Adrian's expression did not change dramatically, but something in his eyes settled, as if a decision he had already made privately had simply been confirmed aloud. "One night," he agreed, "though I suspect, Claire Bennett, that once Daniel sees you standing beside me, one night may prove difficult to contain." I did not understand what he meant then, not fully. I only knew that for the first time since the ring left my hand, I felt something other than grief. I felt the sharp, clean edge of purpose, and beneath it, something more dangerous still, a curiosity about the man across the table that had nothing to do with business at all. We spent another hour discussing details, the timing of the gala, the story we would tell if anyone asked how we met, the ring he would provide that I was to treat as nothing more than a prop for the evening. He walked me to the door when I finally rose to leave, his hand resting briefly at the small of my back, in a gesture that felt strangely protective for a man who had described our arrangement in such clinical terms. "I will send a car for you the day of the gala," he said. "Wear whatever makes you feel like yourself. Nothing about that night should feel like Daniel's world. It should feel entirely like mine." Grace was waiting up when I returned, curled on the couch with a mug of tea gone cold beside her, pretending she had not been watching the clock since I left. She did not ask immediately, only studied my face the way she had studied it 100 times growing up, searching for whatever truth I might try to hide. "You said yes," she said finally, not a question. I sat beside her, pulling my knees up the way I used to when we were children, sharing secrets after our parents had gone to bed. "I did," I admitted. "One gala. He is going to help with the debts from Dad's medical bills." Grace's eyes widened, and for a moment I thought she might argue, might remind me of every warning she had given the night before about the kind of man Adrian Cole truly was. Instead, she reached for my hand, her grip tight and certain. "Then you go in there and you make Daniel regret every single word he said at that dinner table," she said, her voice fierce in a way that surprised me. "You do not owe that family a single ounce of grace after what they did to you." I laughed for the first time in days, a real laugh, surprised at how good it felt after so much silence. I promised her I would be careful, though even as I said the words, I understood that careful had already stopped being the priority, somewhere in that quiet corner of the private club, somewhere between Adrian's honesty and the strange, steadying calm that settled over me whenever he spoke. That night, lying awake long after Grace had gone to bed, I thought about the ring he had mentioned, the one I was meant to treat as nothing more than a prop. I thought about Daniel's face when he saw me, about Vivian's practiced smile faltering for even a single second. I told myself the satisfaction I imagined feeling was simply about justice, about finally standing in a room where nobody could dismiss me the way they had dismissed me at that dinner. But somewhere beneath that reasoning, quieter and harder to admit, was the memory of Adrian's hand, resting briefly at my back as he walked me to the door, steady and warm, in a way that had nothing to do with business arrangements or strategic alliances. I pushed the thought away before it could take root, reminding myself that men like Adrian Cole did not make promises they intended to keep beyond the terms already stated. One night, one gala, nothing more. I did not know yet how much that single decision would change the course of my life, how the man waiting for me in 2 weeks would come to mean far more than the business arrangement he had proposed. I only knew that for the first time in a long while, I was not walking toward my next humiliation. I was walking toward something else entirely, something I could not yet name, but something that felt, for the first time in years, entirely mine to choose. The gown Adrian sent arrived 4 days before the gala, delivered by a quiet woman who introduced herself only as Nadia and refused to leave until she had confirmed the fit against my body with the precision of someone accustomed to perfection. It was emerald green, cut in a way that made me look like a different woman entirely, sleek through the waist and flowing at the hem, with a neckline that spoke of confidence rather than vulnerability. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror after Nadia left, staring at my own reflection, hardly recognizing the woman looking back at me. She looked like someone who had never once sat silently while a man decided her worth. Grace circled me twice, her hand pressed to her mouth. "Daniel is going to lose his mind," she said, and there was fierce satisfaction in her voice that matched the tightening in my own chest. I had spoken to Adrian twice more in the days leading up to the gala. Brief calls to confirm details, the story of how we met reduced to a simple version, involving a mutual business contact, rather than a rain-soaked sidewalk and a discarded engagement. He had not mentioned the ring itself, and I had not asked, though the thought of it settled in my mind more often than I wanted to admit. The night of the gala arrived faster than I expected. A car collected me precisely at 7, sleek and black like the one from that first rainy night, and the driver, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus, who barely spoke beyond a polite greeting, opened the door for me with a formality that made the whole evening feel suddenly very real. Adrian was waiting outside the venue when we arrived, standing beneath the grand entrance of a hotel I had only ever seen photographs of in magazines, dressed in a dark suit that fit him with the kind of precision that spoke of tailors who worked exclusively for men like him. He opened my door himself, waving Marcus back before he could reach it, and offered his hand to help me from the car. "You look exactly like a woman who has nothing left to prove," he said quietly, his eyes moving over me with an appreciation that felt entirely different from the calculated appraisal Daniel used to give me before events, always checking whether I met some invisible standard he had set for how his fiancé should appear. "I feel like her tonight," I admitted, taking his offered arm. The ballroom inside glittered with chandeliers and quiet music, filled with people whose names I recognized only from newspapers and society pages. Adrian moved through the crowd with an ease that commanded attention, without demanding it, introducing me to men and women who greeted him with a respect that bordered on caution, their eyes flicking toward me with open curiosity. "This is Claire, my fiancée," he said each time, the words settling strangely on my ears, though I noticed how the announcement rippled through each small group, how quickly the news seemed to travel from one conversation to the next. I did not see Daniel immediately. For nearly an hour, I allowed myself to enjoy the evening without the shadow of him looming over it, laughing at something clever Adrian said about one of the more pompous guests, feeling for the first time in weeks like a woman rather than a cautionary tale whispered about at family dinners. Then I saw Vivian across the room, her red dress from the engagement dinner replaced by something silver and equally deliberate, and beside her, unmistakably, stood Daniel. He had not seen me yet. I watched him laugh at something one of his business partners said, the same easy charm he had once turned on me before I understood how quickly it could vanish. Adrian must have felt the shift in my posture, because his hand found the small of my back, steady and grounding. "You do not have to do anything," he murmured close to my ear. "Simply exist. That will be enough." It was Vivian who noticed first, her eyes catching on me across the room, then widening as recognition settled in. She touched Daniel's arm, said something quietly, and I watched his expression change as he turned to see what had caught her attention. For a moment, the confidence I had built over the last hour threatened to crumble beneath the weight of his gaze, old instincts urging me to look away, to shrink, to disappear the way I had learned to during our 3 years together. But Adrian's hand remained steady against my back, and something about his presence beside me, solid and unbothered by the tension building across the room, reminded me that I was not the same woman who had sat silently at that dinner table. Daniel approached with Vivian trailing slightly behind him, his expression carefully arranged into something between surprise and polite confusion, though I could see the calculation working behind his eyes. "Claire," he said, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear, "I did not expect to see you here. I did not expect to need an invitation to attend events my fiancé is hosting business with," I replied evenly, gesturing slightly toward Adrian. Daniel's eyes moved to Adrian properly for the first time, and I watched something shift in his expression, recognition dawning slowly, followed swiftly by something that looked remarkably like fear. "Adrian Cole," Daniel said, his voice noticeably less confident than a moment before. "Daniel Whitmore," Adrian replied, his tone perfectly pleasant, perfectly cordial, and somehow more threatening for its calmness than if he had raised his voice at all. "I understand you and Claire have history." "History that ended," I said, before Daniel could offer whatever explanation he had prepared. "Rather publicly, as I recall." Vivian's smile faltered slightly, her gaze moving between Daniel and me with growing unease, as though she were only now understanding the shape of the story she had inserted herself into. Adrian's hand slid from my back to gently take my own, lifting it slightly, and it was only then that I felt the weight of the ring he must have slipped onto my finger sometime during our walk across the room, a weight I had been too distracted to notice until that exact moment. I saw Daniel's eyes drop to it, saw the flicker of shock cross his face, as he registered the size of the stone, the obvious quality of the setting, the unmistakable statement it made, standing beside the modest ring he had once given me, and later demanded back in front of 40 guests. "We are engaged," Adrian said simply, addressing the small crowd that had begun to gather at the edges of our conversation, drawn by the tension in the air. "I intend to make the announcement formally tonight, though I see no reason to delay telling those who matter most." A murmur rippled through the nearby guests, phones discreetly raised, conversations shifting immediately toward the news. I watched Daniel's composure crack slightly at the edges, his jaw tightening as he realized the story unfolding in front of him, the story that would likely reach every corner of the business world he depended on by morning. "You cannot be serious," Daniel said quietly, leaning slightly closer as though proximity might somehow change the reality in front of him. "You barely know this man." "I know him well enough," I said, and for the first time since that rainy sidewalk, I meant every word completely. "I know he does not humiliate the people he cares about in front of a room full of strangers. That is more than I ever knew about you." Vivian's hand tightened on Daniel's arm, and I watched her study him with new eyes, as though my words had planted a seed of doubt that would not be easily removed. Whatever confidence she had carried into the room earlier seemed to falter under the weight of what she was witnessing. Adrian, apparently sensing the moment had reached its natural conclusion, guided me gently away from the conversation with a polite nod toward Daniel and Vivian, the kind of dismissal that carried more power than any raised voice could have managed. "Enjoy your evening," he said over his shoulder, and the words landed with a finality that left Daniel standing silent behind us. We moved deeper into the ballroom, and I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes following our path, whispers trailing behind us, like a current I had somehow learned to swim within, rather than drown beneath. Adrian led me toward a quieter corner near the tall windows overlooking the city, away from the immediate crush of curious guests. "That went rather well," he said, a hint of something almost like amusement in his voice. I looked down at the ring on my finger properly for the first time, a deep emerald surrounded by smaller diamonds, clearly chosen to complement the dress Nadia had delivered days before. It was beautiful in a way that felt entirely separate from the ring Daniel had once given me, heavier, with meaning I had not expected to feel. "You planned this precisely," I said, studying his face carefully. "The dress, the ring, the timing. You knew exactly how this would unfold." "I anticipated it," he corrected gently. "I did not know for certain Daniel would attend tonight, but I hoped he would. I wanted him to see clearly what he lost, and I wanted you to see clearly what you have gained by walking away from him." Something in his tone made me look at him more closely, searching for the calculation I expected to find beneath his words, the strategic distance he had described so plainly during our conversation at the private club. Instead, I found something quieter, something that looked remarkably like genuine care hidden beneath layers of careful control. "This was never only business for you," I said slowly. testing the theory aloud. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment I thought he might deny it, might retreat back into the language of arrangements and strategic positioning that had defined our conversation so far. Instead, he reached for my hand, the one wearing his ring, and studied it thoughtfully before speaking. "I told myself it was business," he admitted quietly. "I told myself I needed a woman who could stand beside me without flinching, and that you fit that description perfectly. But the truth, Claire, is that I have not stopped thinking about a woman standing alone in the rain since the moment I first saw her." The music continued somewhere behind us, the chandeliers glittering above the crowd, and for a moment the entire ballroom seemed to fade into something distant and unimportant beside the quiet honesty in his voice. "I do not know what to do with that information," I admitted, my heart beating faster than the calm evening should have allowed. "You do not need to do anything with it tonight," he said. "Tonight, we simply let Daniel Whitmore watch you shine in a room he no longer has access to. Whatever this becomes beyond tonight, we can decide together, without pressure, without arrangements." I studied his face for a long moment, searching for the deception I had learned to expect from men who spoke smoothly, who offered exactly the words a woman wanted to hear in moments of vulnerability. But there was none of that calculation in Adrian's eyes, only a steadiness that reminded me powerfully of that first rainy night, when he had asked for nothing and offered everything anyway. We stayed at that gala another 2 hours, dancing once beneath the chandeliers, in a way that drew more whispered attention, speaking with guests who no longer looked at me with the pity or curiosity I had feared, but with something closer to respect. Daniel and Vivian left early, slipping out a side entrance sometime before midnight, though I noticed several guests exchanging knowing glances as they departed. By the time Marcus drove me home, the city lights blurring past the car windows in comfortable silence, I understood that whatever had begun as a business arrangement on a rainy sidewalk had already grown into something far more complicated, something that frightened me slightly, with how much I wanted it to continue beyond that single agreed-upon night. Adrian walked me to my door himself, refusing to let Marcus handle that final courtesy, and stood on the small landing outside my apartment, with his hands in his coat pockets, studying me with an expression I was only beginning to learn how to read. "Thank you for tonight," I said, though the words felt insufficient for everything the evening had contained. "The ring is yours to keep," he said quietly, "not as payment, not as part of any arrangement, simply because I think you deserve to hold something beautiful that was given to you honestly, for once." I looked down at the emerald catching the hallway light, then back up at him, aware suddenly of how close we stood, how quiet the building had become around us. "This was supposed to be one night," I reminded him, though my voice lacked any real conviction. "It was," he agreed, "but I find myself entirely unwilling to let it end there." He did not kiss me that night, though I understood from the way his eyes lingered that the thought had crossed his mind as clearly as it had crossed mine. Instead, he simply promised to call, his hand brushing mine briefly before he turned and disappeared down the stairwell, leaving me standing alone, with a ring on my finger that no longer felt like a prop at all. I closed my apartment door behind me and leaned against it for a long moment, my heart still racing from the evening, from Daniel's stunned expression, from Adrian's quiet confession beside the windows overlooking the city. Grace found me there minutes later, still in my gown, staring at nothing in particular, with a smile I could not quite explain. "Well," she said, crossing her arms, "tell me everything." I sat down at the kitchen table, still in my gown, and told her everything from the moment Marcus opened the car door to the way Daniel's face had drained of color when he saw the ring on my hand. Grace listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from delight to something more thoughtful as I described the quiet confession Adrian had offered beside the windows. "He said that," she repeated slowly, studying me across the table. "He said he had not stopped thinking about you since the rain." "He did," I confirmed, still slightly stunned by the memory of it. Grace leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the table in the way she always did when working through a problem. "And how did that make you feel?" she asked, her voice gentler now than the fierce encouragement she had offered days before. "Terrified," I admitted honestly, "and something else I have not felt in a very long time." "What is that?" she asked. "Hopeful," I said, and saying the word aloud made it feel more real than it had felt all evening. Not about proving anything to Daniel. Hopeful about something entirely separate from him. Grace reached across the table and took my hand, turning it gently to study the ring properly under the kitchen light. "It is beautiful," she said quietly. "But Claire, you need to be careful. Whatever business world that man lives in, it is not the kind of world that lets people walk away easily once they are inside it." "I know," I said, though I understood even as I said it that some part of me had already stopped weighing caution as heavily as I should have. "I am not making any promises tonight. I am simply allowing myself to feel something other than heartbreak for the first time in weeks." Grace nodded slowly, though I could see the worry had not fully left her eyes. "Just promise me you will keep your eyes open," she said. "Whatever he is offering you, make sure you are choosing it because it is right for you, not simply because it feels like the opposite of everything Daniel put you through." Her words settled into me long after she had gone to bed, long after I had finally changed out of the gown and hung it carefully in my closet, beside clothes that belonged to an entirely different version of myself. I sat by my window again, the same window where I had turned Adrian's card over and over 3 weeks before. Except this time, the card had become a ring, and the stranger had become something far more complicated than a name on a piece of paper. I thought about the way Daniel's confidence had crumbled the moment he understood who stood beside me. The way Vivian's certainty had wavered under the weight of witnessing something she had not accounted for in her careful plans. There was satisfaction in that memory, sharper and more complete than I had expected to feel. But Grace was right to caution me. That satisfaction alone could not be the foundation for whatever came next. I thought instead about Adrian's steadiness beside the windows, the honesty in his voice when he admitted he had not stopped thinking about me, the careful way he had guided me through the evening without ever once making me feel like an accessory to his ambitions. Whatever waited beyond that single gala, I understood I was walking toward it with my eyes open, aware of the danger Grace had warned me about, and choosing it anyway. I did not know yet how to explain what had happened, how a single night designed to humiliate Daniel had somehow transformed into something that felt like the beginning of an entirely different story, one I had never expected to find myself living. I only knew, sitting there in the quiet of my room with the ring still catching the light, that I was no longer the woman who had walked out of that engagement dinner in the rain. I had become someone else entirely, and I was not yet certain how far that transformation was willing to carry me. The bullet shattered the window of my studio before I even heard the sound that caused it. I dropped to the floor instinctively, my heart slamming against my ribs, glass scattered across the drafting table, where I had been sketching designs only seconds before. For a long moment I simply lay there, too stunned to move, the silence afterward somehow louder than the crash itself. My phone was already ringing when I finally found the courage to reach for it, Adrian's name lighting the screen before I had even processed what happened. "Are you hurt?" he asked the moment I answered, his voice sharper than I had ever heard it. "I do not think so," I said, my own voice shaking. "Someone shot at my studio window." "Do not move," he said. "Marcus is already on his way. Stay away from the windows, and stay on the phone with me until he arrives." I obeyed, crouching low against the wall beneath the shattered glass, listening to Adrian's steady breathing on the other end of the line, as though it alone could keep the world from collapsing further. It had been 3 weeks since the gala, 3 weeks of quiet dinners and long conversations that had slowly transformed our arrangement into something neither of us called by its proper name, though we both understood what it had become. I had learned more about his world in those 3 weeks than I had expected to learn in a lifetime, enough to understand that men like Adrian did not simply inherit power without inheriting enemies alongside it. I had chosen to stay anyway, drawn deeper by a steadiness in him that felt increasingly like home rather than danger. Marcus arrived within minutes, escorting me quickly to a car waiting outside, his usually calm demeanor replaced by a tension that told me more about the severity of the situation than any explanation could have managed. We drove to a building I had never visited before, tall and unmarked, where Adrian was waiting in the lobby, his composure cracking the moment he saw me, pulling me into an embrace that felt entirely unlike the careful distance he usually maintained in public. "You are safe," he murmured against my hair, and I felt the tremor in his hands that betrayed how deeply the moment had shaken him. "Who did this?" I asked, once we reached the privacy of an upper-floor office, still shaking from adrenaline that had not yet fully left my system. Adrian's jaw tightened, his eyes hardening into something I had not seen from him before, cold and calculating in a way that reminded me suddenly of exactly how dangerous his world truly was. "Marco Vasquez," he said finally. "He has wanted to weaken my position for years. Our engagement made you a target he believes will make me vulnerable." I sat down heavily in the chair behind me, processing the reality that a stranger's ambition had nearly cost me my life through a window I had walked past every day for years, without ever once considering danger. "This is because of me," I said quietly, "because I agreed to this." "No," Adrian said firmly, crouching in front of me and taking my hands in his. "This is because Marco is a coward who attacks what he believes is weakest, rather than confronting me directly. None of this is your fault, Claire." I wanted to believe him completely, but fear had settled into my chest in a way that felt impossible to dislodge easily. Over the following days, Adrian arranged additional security around my apartment and the studio, insisting I stay in his building until the threat had been properly addressed, an arrangement that placed us into a closeness neither of us had anticipated so soon. It was during those days that I learned more about the man beneath the careful control he presented to the world. He told me one evening, sitting across from me at his kitchen table, rather than in some formal dining room, about his father, about the empire he had inherited far too young after watching his mother die in circumstances he still refused to fully explain, about a betrayal years before that had taught him never to trust easily, never to let anyone close enough to be used against him. "You let me close," I said quietly, studying his face across the table. "I did not intend to," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "I told myself this remained business for far longer than it actually did. But somewhere between the rain and that gala, Claire, I stopped being able to convince myself of that." Grace visited me at Adrian's building 2 days after the shooting, her face pale with worry the moment security cleared her through the lobby. She hugged me tightly the moment she saw me, holding on longer than usual, and when she finally pulled back, her eyes were rimmed with tears. She had clearly been fighting since hearing the news. "I told you to be careful," she said, though there was no accusation in her voice, only fear. "I am being careful," I said gently, guiding her to sit beside me on the couch in the small sitting room Adrian had arranged for me. "This is not something either of us could have predicted." Grace glanced around the apartment, taking in the quiet luxury of it, the security presence stationed discreetly near the entrance, and I could see her weighing everything she had warned me about against the reality of what I had chosen. "Do you regret it?" she asked finally. "Any of it?" I thought about the question seriously before answering, unwilling to offer her a reassurance I did not entirely feel. "I do not regret Adrian," I said slowly. "I regret that loving him means living with this kind of fear. But I am not certain those two things can be separated from each other. Not in his world." She studied me for a long moment, then reached for my hand the way she had countless times throughout our lives, offering silent support, even when she could not fully understand the choice I had made. "Just promise me, you will not let fear make you smaller," she said finally. "You spent 3 years shrinking for Daniel. Do not shrink for anyone else, even someone you love." I promised her I would not, and I meant it completely, though the promise felt harder to keep with each passing day that brought fresh evidence of Marco's growing hostility toward our engagement. Daniel resurfaced during that same difficult week, a message arriving on my phone that I almost deleted without reading, until curiosity got the better of me. He claimed to have heard about the attack, expressed concern that felt hollow given everything he had put me through, and suggested we meet to talk, hinting that Vivian's family had begun distancing themselves from him following the humiliation of the gala. "I do not owe him anything," I told Adrian that evening, showing him the message with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "He humiliated me in front of my entire family, and now he wants sympathy because his new engagement is unraveling." Adrian read the message carefully, his expression unreadable. "What do you want to do?" he asked, and I appreciated that he asked rather than assumed, that he offered me the choice rather than making it disappear the way Daniel always had. "I do not want to see him," I said firmly. "I have nothing left to say to a man who taught me exactly how little I was worth to him the moment someone wealthier walked into a room." Adrian nodded, something like relief flickering briefly across his features before he composed himself again. "I will have someone respond on your behalf," he offered. "Make it clear that further contact will not be welcome." I appreciated the gesture, but I found myself typing my own response instead, brief and final, telling Daniel that whatever we once shared had ended the moment he chose to end it, in front of everyone who mattered to me, and that I had no interest in revisiting that chapter of my life for his convenience. The threat from Marco Vasquez did not disappear quietly. 2 nights after the shooting, Adrian received word that Marco had made contact with several of his own associates, attempting to convince them that Adrian's engagement to an outsider signaled weakness rather than strength, that the time had come to challenge his position directly. Adrian spent long hours on calls I was not permitted to hear, his voice carrying a steel edge that reminded me constantly of the world he truly inhabited, beneath the careful charm he showed me. "I am not going anywhere," I told him one night, finding him standing at his office window overlooking the city long after midnight, exhaustion evident in the tension across his shoulders. "Whatever this costs, whatever danger comes with it, I am choosing to stay." He turned to look at me, something vulnerable crossing his expression that felt entirely at odds with the powerful man the rest of the world knew him to be. "You do not fully understand what staying might cost you," he said quietly. "Marco will not stop with a single warning shot if he believes threatening you weakens my resolve." "Then we make certain he understands it does not," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my own voice. Adrian crossed the room and pulled me close, his hands framing my face with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the danger surrounding us both. "I never intended for any of this to become real," he admitted quietly. "I convinced myself I was offering you protection, security, an escape from a life that had humiliated you. I did not expect to fall in love with the woman I was supposedly protecting." The words landed with a weight that stole the breath from my lungs entirely. I had felt the shift between us building for weeks, in quiet dinners and careful conversations, in the way his hand found mine without conscious thought, in the steadiness that had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. Hearing him say it plainly, without the careful distance he usually maintained, felt like the final piece of a puzzle I had been assembling since that first rainy night. "I think I fell in love with you somewhere between the rain and the ring," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He kissed me then, finally, after weeks of careful restraint, and it felt entirely different from anything Daniel had ever offered me, steady and certain in a way that made the danger surrounding us feel momentarily distant, though I understood it remained close enough to threaten everything we were building together. The following morning, Marcus arrived with news that shattered whatever peace that kiss had briefly offered. Marco Vasquez had made his intentions explicit overnight, sending word through intermediaries that he intended to force a confrontation at an event scheduled for the following week, a business gathering where several of Adrian's most important allies would be present, an event where Marco clearly intended to make his challenge as public and humiliating as possible. Adrian's expression hardened the moment he heard the details, the vulnerability from the previous night replaced entirely by the calculating focus of a man preparing for war. "This ends there," he said firmly, more to himself than to me or Marcus standing nearby. "Marco wants a public confrontation. He will get one, but not on terms he expects." I watched him transform in front of me, the gentle man who had kissed me only hours before giving way to someone I had glimpsed only briefly at the gala, when he confronted Daniel with such quiet, devastating control. I did not fully understand yet what confrontation he was planning, but I understood clearly that whatever happened at that event would determine far more than simply our engagement. It would determine whether the man I had fallen in love with, despite every warning Grace had offered, would survive the world he had inherited, and whether I was prepared to stand beside him through whatever came next, regardless of the danger that world continued to promise. "I am coming with you," I told him firmly, meeting his eyes without flinching, despite everything happening around us. Adrian studied me for a long moment, something like pride flickering behind the tension in his expression. "I would not have it any other way," he said finally. "Whatever Marco intends to prove at that event, he is about to learn precisely how wrong he is about both of us." That night, unable to sleep, I sat with Adrian in his study as he reviewed reports Marcus had gathered on Marco's movements over the past weeks. I watched him work with a focus I had not seen from him before, methodical and unhurried despite the danger closing in around us, and I understood then why the people in his world spoke of him with such careful respect. He did not react to threats with panic or bravado. He simply prepared, thoroughly and completely, until the outcome became inevitable, before the confrontation ever began. "You are not afraid," I observed quietly, watching him mark something in the margin of a report. "I am afraid," he corrected, not looking up from the page. "I am afraid of what happens if I fail to protect the people I care about. But fear does not help me plan, so I set it aside until the work is finished." I thought about Grace's warning, about the promise I had made not to shrink myself out of fear, and I found myself reaching for one of the reports myself, determined to understand as much of this world as Adrian would allow me to see. He glanced at me with something like surprise, then, after a moment of consideration, began explaining the details laid out before us, treating me not as someone to be protected from the truth, but as someone capable of standing beside him within it. We worked together long into the night, and somewhere in the quiet exchange of information and careful strategy, I felt the last of my hesitations settle into something firmer, something closer to resolve. Whatever waited at that event the following week, I intended to face it not as a woman hiding behind Adrian's protection, but as a partner standing fully beside him. The ballroom fell silent the moment Marco Vasquez walked through the doors, his presence commanding attention, the way a storm commands the sky before it breaks. I stood beside Adrian, near the center of the room, dressed in deep navy this time, a color he had chosen deliberately for its association with calm authority, rather than the softer tones I had worn to previous events. Marcus stood at a discreet distance, along with two other men I had come to recognize as part of Adrian's inner circle, their presence a quiet reminder that tonight carried stakes far beyond ordinary business rivalry. Marco was tall, broad-shouldered, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, the kind of confidence that came from years of believing himself untouchable. He crossed the room directly toward us, ignoring the dozens of other guests who fell silent in his wake, sensing the tension building between the two most powerful men in the room. "Adrian Cole," Marco said, his voice carrying an edge of mockery beneath its polite surface. "I hear congratulations are in order. An engagement to an outsider. How refreshingly sentimental of you." I held my ground beside Adrian, refusing to let the fear I still carried from that shattered window show on my face. Adrian's hand found mine briefly, steady and grounding, before releasing it, as he stepped slightly forward to meet Marco's challenge directly. "Marco," he said, his voice calm in a way that somehow felt more dangerous than any raised threat could have managed. "I understand you have been telling certain associates that my engagement signals weakness. I thought it best we discuss that theory directly, in front of everyone here tonight." A murmur moved through the nearby guests, and I could see several of them shifting their attention fully toward the confrontation unfolding before them, understanding instinctively that something significant was about to happen. "Weakness takes many forms," Marco said, his eyes flicking toward me with an appraisal that made my skin crawl. "A man who allows sentiment to interfere with business judgment, a man who cannot protect what belongs to him from a simple warning shot through a window." The room went utterly still. I understood then that Marco intended to claim credit for the shooting publicly, to humiliate Adrian in front of the very allies whose confidence he needed to maintain his position. My heart raced, but I forced myself to remain steady, remembering Grace's warning about shrinking, remembering the promise I had made to myself weeks before in that private club when I first agreed to this arrangement. "That warning shot," Adrian said, his voice dropping into something colder than I had ever heard from him, "was a mistake you will regret making, Marco. Not because it frightened me, because it confirmed something I suspected but had not yet proven, something I have spent the last 2 weeks gathering evidence to support in front of exactly the people whose trust you depend upon." Marco's confident expression faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to my ears. "You have nothing," he said, though there was less certainty in his voice than a moment before. Adrian gestured slightly, and one of his associates stepped forward with a tablet, offering it first to Adrian before he turned it toward the small crowd of gathered witnesses, several of whom I recognized as men Marco had clearly hoped to convince of his own strength in recent weeks. "Financial records, Adrian said calmly, showing evidence of Marco diverting resources from shared ventures for personal gain over the past 18 months. Communications discussing plans to destabilize alliances that have kept peace in this city for over a decade. And, most recently, arrangements made with the individual who fired that shot through my fiancé's studio window. An individual currently cooperating fully with authorities, in exchange for reduced consequences. The silence that followed felt different from the tension that had preceded it. Heavier, more final. I watched the faces of the men gathered around us shift from curiosity to something closer to calculated distance, understanding immediately that whatever alliance they had once considered with Marco had evaporated entirely in the face of such public evidence. "You cannot prove any of this ties directly to me," Marco said, though his voice had lost the confident edge it carried only minutes before. "I do not need to prove it in a courtroom," Adrian said quietly. "I only need these people to understand that associating with you carries more risk than reward." I suspect that understanding has already settled quite firmly in this room. Several of the men near Marco began to step back, putting distance between themselves and a man whose position had crumbled entirely within a matter of minutes, their loyalty evaporating with the same swiftness it had likely been offered. Marco looked around at the shifting crowd, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally something closer to defeat, as he understood the full scope of what Adrian had orchestrated. "This is not finished," Marco said, though the threat carried little weight, now that his support had visibly abandoned him. "It is finished," Adrian said simply. "You attacked someone I love to send me a message. Consider this my response." Marco left shortly after, his exit far less commanding than his entrance had been, trailed by only a single associate, rather than the group that had surrounded him upon arrival. I felt the tension leave my body slowly, my hands finally steady again, as Adrian turned to face me fully, something like relief visible beneath his composed exterior. "You did that entirely for me," I said quietly, still processing the magnitude of what had just unfolded. "I did it because he threatened the person who matters most to me," Adrian said, taking both my hands in his despite the audience still watching us with open curiosity. "There is a difference, though I understand why the distinction might feel small right now." The evening continued around us, conversations slowly returning to normal levels as guests processed what they had witnessed, several approaching Adrian afterward with renewed deference that confirmed his position had only strengthened through the confrontation, rather than weakened as Marco had hoped. It was near the end of the evening, as guests began departing and the ballroom slowly emptied, that Daniel appeared, uninvited and clearly unwelcome, though I suspected he had learned about the gathering through some remaining business connection and decided to witness the outcome himself. He approached carefully, aware of the security presence that shifted subtly closer the moment he entered the room, and stopped several feet away, his earlier confidence entirely absent from his posture. "Claire," he said quietly, "I heard about what happened at your studio. I wanted to make sure you were all right." I studied him for a long moment, searching for the man I had once loved beneath the careful concern he now offered, finding only a stranger, whose priorities had always centered on appearances rather than substance. "I am more than all right," I said finally. "I am exactly where I choose to be." "Vivian left him," Daniel admitted suddenly, the words tumbling out as though he had been holding them back since arriving. "Her family withdrew their support after the gala. I have lost everything I built with them." I understood he wanted sympathy, perhaps even hoped some remaining affection might soften my response, but I found only clarity where old feelings had once lived. "I am sorry that happened to you," I said honestly, because I did not wish him ill, despite everything he had put me through. "But I am not the answer to what you lost, Daniel. I never was, not really. You wanted someone who made you look successful, not someone you actually valued." His jaw tightened, old pride flaring briefly, before settling into something closer to resignation. "You deserve happiness," he said finally, glancing briefly toward Adrian standing protectively nearby. "I hope you find it." "I already have," I said simply, and watched him nod once, before turning and walking away, disappearing from the ballroom and, I understood clearly, from the remainder of my life entirely. Adrian's hand found the small of my back as Daniel departed, steady and familiar, in a way that no longer felt like performance but simply like truth. That took considerable strength, he said quietly. It took less than I expected, I admitted, surprised by how little the encounter had actually affected me. I think I finished letting go of him the moment you put that ring on my finger. We left the gala shortly after, Marcus driving us through streets that felt entirely different than they had on that first rainy night nearly 2 months before. Adrian remained quiet during the drive, his hand wrapped around mine, something contemplative in his expression that I recognized from the nights he worked through difficult decisions. When we arrived at his building, he did not lead me immediately inside, instead guiding me toward the small garden terrace on the ground floor, quiet and private, beneath the city lights scattered across the evening sky. I have been thinking about something, he said, turning to face me fully, his usual composure replaced by something more uncertain than I had ever witnessed from him. What is that? I asked, my heart beginning to race, though I could not yet identify why. This began as an arrangement, he said slowly. A ring meant to serve a purpose for a single night. I gave you that ring because I wanted Daniel to understand what he lost, and because some part of me, even then, wanted an excuse to keep you close. I remember, I said softly, watching him carefully. That ring was never truly mine to give, in the way it mattered, he continued, reaching into his coat pocket with hands that trembled slightly, an unfamiliar uncertainty from a man who commanded rooms without effort. It served its purpose that night, but everything I feel for you now has grown into something entirely separate from that arrangement. He opened a small box, revealing a ring far simpler than the elaborate emerald he had provided for the gala. A single diamond set in gold, understated in a way that felt entirely personal rather than strategic. Claire Bennett, he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability written clearly across his face. I am not asking you this as part of any business arrangement, any strategy, any performance for an audience. I am asking you because I love you, entirely and without condition, and because I cannot imagine building the rest of my life beside anyone else. Tears gathered in my eyes, warm and entirely different from the tears I had shed on that rainy sidewalk 2 months before. I thought about the woman who had stood silently at that engagement dinner, accepting humiliation because she believed it was the price of being loved. I thought about how far I had traveled since then, not simply into Adrian's world, but into a version of myself who understood her own worth completely. Yes, I said, my voice breaking slightly around the word. Completely and entirely, yes. He slid the ring onto my finger with hands still trembling, then pulled me close, kissing me beneath the city lights with a certainty that held nothing back, nothing calculated, nothing performed for anyone watching. When we finally parted, I rested my forehead against his, both of us breathing unsteadily in the aftermath of everything the evening had contained. I love you, I whispered, the words feeling entirely natural after weeks of building toward this exact moment. I love you too, he said, and hearing him speak in the intimacy of that private terrace after so many months carried far more weight than any of the moments we had shared before it. I love you far more than I expected to when I first stepped out of that car in the rain. We stood together on that terrace for a long while afterward, the city continuing its indifferent rhythm around us, unaware that somewhere within its endless noise, a woman who had once been humiliated in front of everyone she loved had finally found something entirely her own. I thought about Grace's warning to never shrink myself again, about my mother's quiet strength during the darkest night of my life, about the journey that had carried me from a rain-soaked sidewalk to this exact moment, standing beside a man who had chosen me not out of strategy or convenience, but out of genuine, undeniable love. Daniel had taught me what it felt like to be discarded. Adrian had taught me what it felt like to be chosen, fully and completely, without condition or calculation. I understood, standing there with his ring on my finger and his arms around me, that the humiliation which had once felt like the ending of everything had actually been the beginning of the life I was always meant to find. Grace was still awake when I finally returned to her apartment the next morning to share the news, her eyes widening the moment she saw the simple diamond ring catching the morning light through her kitchen window. She let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob, pulling me into an embrace so tight I nearly lost my balance. You said yes, she said, though it was hardly a question given the evidence on my hand. I said yes, I confirmed, laughing through my own tears as she pulled back to study the ring properly. "This one is different from the one he gave you at the gala," she observed, turning my hand gently under the light. "This one is real," I told her, and watching understanding dawn across her face felt like closing a circle that had opened the night Daniel discarded me in front of our entire family. This one was never about proving anything to anyone else. My mother cried when I told her later that afternoon, though her tears carried none of the worry that had shadowed her expression the night of the engagement dinner 2 months before. She held my face in her hands the way she had when I was small, studying me carefully before speaking. "Your father would have liked him," she said quietly, "not because of anything he owns or controls, but because of the way he looks at you. Like you are the only person in the room worth seeing." I thought about that observation often in the weeks that followed, as Adrian and I built something steady and lasting from the foundation that arrangement had unexpectedly become. Marco Vasquez disappeared from the city's business circles entirely within a month, his remaining associates scattering to protect their own positions once his influence collapsed completely. Adrian never spoke of him again beyond a brief mention that the matter had been resolved permanently, and I understood without needing further explanation that whatever justice his world demanded had already been delivered. Daniel, I heard through distant relatives who still maintained connections to his family, moved to another city entirely, attempting to rebuild a reputation that had crumbled following Vivian's departure and the public collapse of his engagement plans. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet, settled peace that came from understanding I no longer needed his suffering to validate my own worth. My life had moved so far beyond him that his continued existence barely registered as more than a distant memory of a chapter I had firmly closed. Adrian and I married in a small ceremony 6 months later, nothing like the extravagant gala where our public engagement had first been announced, attended only by Grace, my mother, and a handful of people from Adrian's world whom he trusted completely. I wore a simple dress, nothing like the elaborate gown Nadia had once delivered for a night designed purely for performance, because this moment required no audience beyond the people who genuinely mattered. Standing across from Adrian as he spoke his vows, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes, I thought about the woman who had stood frozen at that engagement dinner table, accepting humiliation, because she believed silence was the price of being loved. That woman felt impossibly distant now, replaced entirely by someone who understood her own worth so completely that no room, no audience, no former fiancé could ever again convince her otherwise. "I promise to choose you every single day," Adrian said during his vows, his hand steady around mine despite the vulnerability written across his face for everyone present to witness, not out of strategy, not out of arrangement, but because loving you has become the truest thing I know. "I promise the same," I said, my voice carrying none of the uncertainty that had once defined every significant moment of my life before him. "I promise to never again mistake silence for peace, or humiliation for love. I promise to stand beside you exactly as myself, fully and without apology, for as long as you will have me." The city lights glittered around us that evening as we celebrated quietly among the people who mattered most, endless and indifferent to the private happiness unfolding beneath them. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt entirely, completely certain of exactly where I belonged.